Oh, hello, and welcome to the Sunday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. I hope you can hear me. I have no way to know if you can, but let's just hope the microphone is accurately plugged in. And speaking of microphones, the subject of today's Sunday stream edition of Adam's Music Box is what is the most important technology that aided music delivery, meaning how consumers, how listeners receive their artificial music. And by artificial, I mean something other than a live performance. So, my theory in all of this, and it's a very controversial one, it will piss off the boomers, it will piss off the academicians. It's that streaming is the most important technological development in music delivery. And before I get into why, I want to sort of look at the competition because there's, as someone might say, there's a lot of subject matter, a lot. So obviously, it would almost be too easy, but perhaps also accurate to say that recorded sound itself was the most important innovation ever. And for that, we have to look at Thomas Edison and his original phonograph, his cylinders. Very low quality in terms of fidelity, but it was the first time that you could play music and have that exact music reproduced, albeit in very, very low fidelity that was quite distant from the original live sound. Even before Edison, though, there was something that was 100% perfect fidelity, the fidelity that equaled a live performance. And this was the self playing instrument, what I call the first musical artificial intelligence, because it is using a programming code essentially to tell a piece of machinery what to do. And that thing that it's doing is simulating real human playing. And the most famous of the self playing instruments is, of course, the player piano, but they had self playing organs, they had self playing one man bands, the types of things that you would see in these elaborate organs at merry-go-rounds and other things like fairs where there would be, drums and glockenspiel and all sorts of other organ sounds. And the way that all of these self-playing instruments work is that you would take a roll, not as in bread, not Bread the band either, David Gates. No relation to Bill, I think. But you would take these pieces of paper that looked kind of like Braille writing, but with the holes punched out, and a mechanical roller would read these pieces of paper and it would provide the instructions for which note and which instrument, if it's a multi-instrumental organ type of situation, to play. And a lot of these roles in the late 19th and early 20th century they were created by very well-known pianists. Many composers played their own music and you could literally take it home with them. One of my favorite composers ever, Alexander Scriabin, he made quite a few of his piano rolls, which have now been recorded, and you can actually hear at least a simulation of what it was like to hear Scriabin play live. And of course, because these were real organs and real pianos, the fidelity was perfect. They were actual instruments being played by mechanical devices. So one could argue that that was the most important invention ever. Of course, the microphone, which itself has lineage to Edison's telephone, the electric microphone of the 1920s that Western Electric developed, along with amplification as we now know it, you could say that was the most important invention. Or you could say Marconi's radio. He's not the guy that owns the Italian restaurants. Totally different guy, totally different name. And of course, radio became a staple of the household in at least the first world in the 1920s. And radio was absolutely revolutionary. What about magnetic tape, the beginning of high fidelity, and the original stereo experiments that Magnetophone, the company that in Germany invented the magnetic tape, did in the 1940s? Maybe it was that. Was it the long playing record, the 45 RPM single? Was it FM radio in glorious stereo for all you Steely Dan fans out there? Some will get the reference. Was it digital audio? I mean, again, so lots and lots of competition for what the most important invention in music delivery is. And I'm sure that I am forgetting many. But I want to look at streaming because whenever you're judging an invention's magnitude, you have to think of the what I call the caveman test, or you could call it the ignorant man test. So here's how it works. If you were to describe an ignoramus or a primitive man, an invention, which invention would seem the most incredible, the most literally unbelievable, the most magical to them? Which is the kind that if you went into some deep, dark forest, which one would they, tie you to a tree and spear you to death over because it's witchcraft, it is sorcery? And I kind of think that the invention that passes that test with the most flying colors is streaming. And here's why. Here's how I would describe streaming to a primitive man. Are you aware of what sound is? Are you aware of what music is? Boom, boom, boom. Okay, you have an idea. So, what if I told you, Mr. Ooga Booga, that there is a box, a tiny box, one so small that you can hold in your hand? I would say pocket, but you're standing in front of me wearing absolutely no clothes, and the loincloth just blew off, even though I'm not like that. But anyway, let's say that you have this device in your hand, and you can tell it, you can type or speak the request to hear just about any piece of music that has ever been recorded. And then, I'm running away and it's the heart of darkness and this is the end, beautiful friend. Because that idea is something that would be mind-blowing. And it's something that frankly would be mind-blowing even to a modern sophisticated man of the 70s, 80s, or 90s. The idea that, well, hang on a second. You don't need to go to the record store to buy an LP, a CD, a tape, whatever. You can just have the music brought to you directly without any physical form. And of course, a lot of modern men were thinking about this long before streaming. Frank Zappa himself, he was either on Joan Rivers or Jay Leno when he was filling in for Carson in the late 80s, who said that he thinks that he was talking about what it's like owning his own mail order record company, because Barking Pumpkin Records, they didn't have a distribution network the way that the major labels did. And so in the 80s, if you wanted to order a Frank Zappa record or later CD, you would have to do the mail order service, a bit like the Sears catalog, but a lot more cool. And he said that he envisages the future of music delivery as being something that would work with cable, much the way that you had pay-per-view television, which was big in the 80s. So you would enter a code on your remote control to say, I want to watch this exclusive movie, or I want to watch this exclusive boxing match. I mean, the 80s was an era when a lot of the biggest matches were still on network TV, but you had many on HBO, which is and is a premium service. Now it's mostly streaming. And you had certain that you just had to literally pay per view. I want to watch this boxing match. You press a button on the remote control, you enter all the credit card details, and on channel 58, Mike Tyson is coming on at 8 o'clock, that type of thing. And Zappa had the idea that music could work the same way. And that was pretty much Spotify. That worked on a closed circuit cable system. Spotify works as an app that's tied into the World Wide Web. But those technicalities aside, that is what Zappa was thinking of. So the idea that you don't need a physical media to control your own music was something that others had been thinking about. It's basically like having your own radio station, only instead of phoning up the DJ every 30 seconds to request the latest hit by Supertramp, you could make the selection yourself. No DJ required. Because radio, of course, was an instance of not having physical media as well. But there was physical media in a radio studio where people like Wolfman Jack and Art LeBeau and Casey Kasem were playing it for you. Now, Spotify obviously wasn't the first thing. There were MP3s in the early 90s on various download sites, many of which were user-unfriendly, none of which really cracked the mainstream. There was mp3.com, but much more important, especially to the young people of the 1990s, was Napster. Now, Napster wasn't a streaming service. It was peer-to-peer file sharing, where individuals with their physical media collections would upload them to their own computer, and Napster would act as a essentially networking device that would allow you to download, let's say Billy in Idaho had Judas Priest British Steel on his PC. You could download it from him. Let's say that you uploaded sketches of Spain by Miles Davis to your PC, and Billy could download that, and this replicated all over the world. Now, this was beloved by people everywhere, particularly the young. And yeah, because it was free, but I think there's something a bit more important than that. Young people, when they get their hands on money, music in the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they splurged on music because music was something that was still central to the lives of young people, less so today. And so whether it was your allowance, whether it was mom or dad taking you to the music store, whether it was your summer job or your full-time job or whatever, maybe you robbed a few banks if you're from a certain part of town, but you spent it on music. I mean, if you wanted to rob a bank, why not just rob the record store? They probably have less security. But hey, I'm not here to administer the IQ test. And so Napster was brilliant, I think, not necessarily just because it was free, but because of the selection. It had everything, just about everything. And, the sky was the limit. And the music industry should have saw this as a blessing. They should have said, let's buy this. Let's acquire this company. We'll figure out a way how to make money from it. Mark Zuckerberg, interestingly enough, when talking about Facebook and when they were trying to discover how to monetize it, he said, and, I disagree with a lot of his public views on issues, but on this, I tend to think he was correct. He said, if you have a great idea and can get it invented, don't worry right away about how it can make money. Because if the idea is good and it becomes popular, some clever accounting type will come around and figure out how it can make money for the investors, the shareholders, the owners, etc. And that's the way the music industry should have approached Napster. Should have bought the company, researched the technology, and found a way to monetize it. But they were stupid, and they sued Napster out of existence. A million clones popped up, and then Steve Jobs said, look, the jig is up. I'm going to invent something called iTunes where people can download music legally, and it will cost, but it will be very cost effective because the low price of 99 cents per song is the only way that we can compete with the free stuff, because the free stuff in the early 2000s had a lot of viruses. Napster never did, to my knowledge, but things like LimeWire and Kazaa, they got it was from a different era in terms of cybersecurity. So Steve Jobs said that cost benefit analysis, if it's $1 per song and there's no safe cybersecurity issues, people will go for it. Music industry huffed and puffed. That's too cheap. Plus, we don't want to sell individual songs from albums. We want to sell albums as a whole. And Steve Jobs said, take it or leave it. And the music industry had to take it. Now, this is still the era of downloads, but there were some early proto-streaming services. There was something called Rhapsody, which was a very early streaming service, and the fidelity was very low because the internet wasn't as fast as it later became in the early 2000s. There was something called Pandora, which still actually exists, which it's not a streaming service as such, but it used algorithms to basically play. It was like a digital radio station based on your preferences, and it still exists, though much less popular than traditional streaming. Now, Spotify came out in 2006 in Sweden. Derp, 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 derp. The Swedish people don't actually talk like that, but hey, this was before IKEA conquered the world, or was it? I think it was around. And so why is it significant that it came about in Sweden? Well, in 2006, there was also something in Sweden that formed called the Pirate Party. It was basically a rebellion against online surveillance and the notion of intellectual property. Now, I think intellectual property is important because I think creative people deserve to be paid just as much as non-creative people, and frankly, even more than creative accountants. But there was a lot of anger that the people who owned the intellectual property weren't necessarily artistic or creative types, but very unappealing corporate types. And there was a socio-political rebellion against this type of thing in Sweden. Now, Spotify never really came into existence to be anything but a business, but it was created in this spirit of let's liberate the content. And so it's one of the few inventions in this tale that came from a small country. Most of these inventions came from America, and some of the other others came from Germany. One of the first microphones was invented in Germany. The best microphones later on in the 20s and 30s were invented in Germany. Magnetic tape was invented in Germany. And just about all of these other inventions came from America. Edison's inventions, Western Electric. Obviously, the compact disc was a Japanese invention with some Dutch input, but you get the idea. Japan is a big country. But Sweden did put streaming on the map because of Spotify, even though it took a while for Spotify to go outside of Sweden. It started expanding in Europe, and then it came to America in 2011, and now it's pretty much worldwide. Now, what made Spotify possible is that the internet was getting fast enough to make streaming efficacious, if you will. And even mobile internet, the 3G service of the day, it was good enough to stream most of this stuff. And once 4G came in, it was kind of game over for downloads. And I think it was probably around 2015 that streaming overtook downloads as the most typical way that people ended up receiving their music. And since then, not a lot has happened. Streaming is now part of the culture. The internet has got even faster. And so now you have streaming in high fidelity. Because one of the problems in the early days of streaming is it was rather low fidelity. And Spotify still is data compressed. But you have things like Tidal, which are capable of 24 192 PCM, ultra high fidelity. They don't have DSD streaming. It would be cool if they did. They have DSD downloads. So you have totally uncompressed and high resolution music on Apple, and you have other services like that too. And Spotify does say that they're going to come out with a high resolution tier as well. So streaming really is the thing now. It's convenient. The music is ubiquitous. The quality now equals that. It surpasses that in the digital realm of a traditional Redbook compact disc on places like Tidal. And so there's really not a lot to complain about when it comes to streaming from a technological point of view. From a business model point of view, it's a totally different matter. And that's why this stream is about the technology, not the business model, because I mean, artists were getting screwed since the inception of the music industry, whether it was unfair contracts in the age of records and tapes, all the way up to the fact that streaming plays very, very little per stream. And you have to be a really big artist like Taylor Swift to negotiate a better deal than the sort of boilerplate that Spotify is willing to give you. That really ought to change. Lots of people have discussed how not a lot has changed as of yet. But speaking of it purely as a technological phenomenon, I really do think that it's kind of, if you'll pardon the pun, it's a magical music box. You type in or speak whatever you want to hear, and voila, within seconds, you're hearing it. And the fact that the selection is so huge is really something that was unimaginable. I mean, even a radio station was restricted to one or two genres. They wouldn't have tapes or LPs of Beethoven symphonies at your local rock radio station. Your country and western radio station probably wouldn't have a Black Sabbath cartridge, because that was the number one tape cards to play the music. But Spotify has everything, and you can listen to it whenever you want, wherever you want, and however you want. And when I say Spotify, I mean streaming. That's just the most popular streaming service, but the same applies to Apple and Tidal and Amazon and Deezer and all of the others. So it's a controversial statement because there have been so many important technologies that preceded streaming without which streaming would not be possible. But I have to say that when it comes to the primitive man, the caveman, all the world's music in one box would definitely get you condemned for sorcery. And therefore, if that's what a primitive person would think of the technology, I think that it is one of mankind's best inventions when it comes to music delivery. But let me know what you think. This will piss off a lot of the people who love physical media. I love physical media too, but we also know that unless you own a university-sized music library, Spotify is going to have more music. And I love more music. Let me know what you think. And as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.